I want to welcome everyone back to Mishnah in Depth. This is Mishnah in Depth Horayot with Dr. Joshua Kulp. It's great to see new faces, old faces. It is also great to return to Mishnah in Depth Live. This Mishnah in Depth series is sponsored in the memory of Rifka Rosenwein by her family. We are a weekly course where we are following the standard Mishnah daily study schedule of learning when to do mishnayot each day independently, and we'll come together once a week to review. And over weeks and months, we will complete whole tractates and even whole orders. It's such a pleasure to have Dr. Kulp here teaching for the first time. He is currently a senior scholar at the Conservative Yeshiva. He is the co-author of the Shachter Haggadah and Reconstructing the Talmud Volume 1 and 2. He is a Musmach of Hadar Institute and received his doctorate in Talmud from Bar Ilan. It's really great to have him as a teacher, and he has provided a source packet, which I will post in the comments once things get underway. And with that, I'm going to turn things over.
Okay, good afternoon. I guess it's already afternoon. So we're going to be learning Horayot, Mishnah Horayot this week and next week. This is my first time teaching for Drisha. Larry, I'm familiar with. Edina, you are a new student, and it's great to have you. And I'm sure there's other people who are going to be listening on recording. So if there are comments, please share them with me. If there are, I haven't taught in this format yet. So if there are, the things that you would like to see on source sheets in the future, I'm happy to adjust. And I'm very flexible, and I would really just like to get us an idea of what Masechet Horayot is. What does it deal with? What are the problems it deals with? In particular, how it relates to the Torah. Masechet Horayot is a very interesting Masechet. Largely speaking, it is about two passages in the Torah. We're going to look at both of them. We're going to deal with some midrash. There is a lot of midrash on related to Horayot. The word Horayot means instructions, and we're going to talk about that as well. It's largely about sins that occur due to a wrongful ruling by the high court in Jerusalem, right back when the temple still stood. But there's some really interesting material here, in particular, in between the relationship between the Mikra, the simple understanding of the Mikra, and how the rabbis interpret the Torah. And there's also, I think, some very interesting material about the need to expiate for sin. The need to bring a korban to cleanse. A chatat, we're going to talk a little bit about the chatat. A chatat, usually translated as a sin offering, is better translated as a cleansing offering, or it's an offering that needs to be brought, because in the biblical imagination, when somebody commits certain types of sins, right, they cause a stain on the community, a stain on the temple, a stain on the Mizbeach, and those sins need to be expiated. We're going to look a little bit about the difference between that and the rabbinic conception of the chet, of a sin, right? There's obviously a lot that could be said about that, so we're going to try to focus on material that's relevant to Horayot. All right, I'm going to share my screen. We're not going to, in these two classes, not going to get through a certain specified amount of material. Instead, we're just going to, see what we learn within an hour. Class will not be longer than an hour, probably won't be shorter than an hour. We will stick to that. Boker Tov, Ken, great to see you here as well. All right, or Tzoraim Tovim. So I wanted to start with the concept of shogeg. Which is an important, shogeg means an accidental sin. And I want to show what I think is a really remarkable transformation in terms of the way the rabbis understand the meaning of an accidental sin. I think the simple biblical read of an accidental sin is just someone committed an act that is not to be done. The Torah says it's not to be done, and someone committed that act. I don't think there's anywhere really in the Torah that really shows that it matters all that much, the mental awareness of that person, as long as it wasn't intentional, right? There's like basically two categories. There's a zadon, right? Mezid, intentional. Intentional sins cannot be expiated, atoned for by sacrifice. Right? That's straightforward in the Torah. The system of sacrifices allows for the expiation of unintentional sins, and they need to be expiated for, right? Of certain categories, not all categories. And intentional sins can only be atoned for in other ways, but not through a sacrifice. Sacrifice was designed to cleanse for an unintentional sin. But it seems, I think, that anything that's done without intention is just counts as an accidental sin. And I brought here, there's probably other places as well, but I think this is the classic location of what does it mean for something to be an unintentional sin. So let's read the text. I did not translate all of these because I really didn't know the level. I will translate as we talk, but they're also, right, today, hopefully there are translations available online if people want to look them up. And if people want me to next time put more translations into the source sheet, I'm happy to do that as well. Welcome, Deborah. Okay. Ger shenit gayer bein hagoyim va'asa melacha b'Shabbat. All right, somebody who converts and living among the non-Jews, right? Which assumedly, right, how that we're not going to talk about how do you convert without ever learning any Jewish laws. Right? This is a major problem for rabbinic views of conversion, but we're not learning about conversion today. So somebody who converts ve'asa melacha b'Shabbat, and he does prohibited labor on Shabbat, but he literally does not know that there is such a thing as prohibited labor on Shabbat, or he doesn't know the particulars. For instance, he sows, writes, you can find any plants, harvests, something, whatever is prohibited on Shabbat, he does one of those things, and he has no idea. He's Jewish, but he has no idea that what he's done was wrong, and he never knew. Right? That's the important thing here. He never knew. Right? He didn't forget, he just never knew. Rabbi Akiva mechayev Munbaz poter. Rabbi Akiva says he's liable for a sin offering, a chatat, and Munbaz says he's exempt.
How did he get converted without knowing anything?
So if you were to ask me, I actually wrote an article about this about 25 years ago, right? If you were to, like, the rabbinic laws of conversion developed over the centuries. I think that probably the earliest version of conversion was just, you heard about the Jews, right? You wanted to join the Jewish people. You heard, I don't know, their God is great, right? Their God is great. And you decided you wanted to convert. The main step for a man would have been circumcision, right? And that's probably about it, okay? Again, I don't think by the time you get into the real, like the heart of the rabbinic period, this doesn't work anymore, but they seem to be, at least in the Tannaitic period, they seem to be familiar with it. I can share this some other time, I don't know, either through Drisha. I wrote an article in an academic journal about the development of the laws of conversion. And conversion earlier seemed to be something that people did on their own. Josephus talks that way. Second Temple sources talk that way. The rabbis create more of a educational ritual, which is what we're more familiar with. Today, you can't convert without knowing about Shabbat, right? It's impossible. Right. Interesting here, though, that Rabbi Akiva, this is Rabbi Akiva versus Munbaz, a Tana who never appears anywhere else. And Munbaz strikingly seems to win this, right? If you look at the rest of the Mishnah, it's really Munbaz's point of view that carries the day, right? Rabbi Akiva would be, as long as there's a sin committed, Shabbat was transgressed, a sacrifice has to be brought. And Munbaz says no, he's exempt. Why? V'hadin noten. This is logical sheyeh patur. This is Munbaz speaking here, that he should be exempt. Ho'il v'shogeg chayav chatat u'mezid chayav karet. Right? Somebody who acts accidentally is liable for a sin offering, and someone who acts on purpose is liable for karet, a more severe punishment, whatever that might be. Ma mezid eno chayav ad sheyavo lichal yediyah. You can't sin intentionally unless you know, right? Sinning intentionally is a mental act, right? If I, let's say, plant on Shabbat and I know it's wrong, then it's intentional. And if I plant on Shabbat and I don't know it's wrong, then it's unintentional. Okay, the whole difference is in my mind. Right, I did the exact same thing. That's the difference. We all know that's the difference in intention and non-intention. Right, it's intuitive and it's obvious. Unintentional sin can only occur, according to Munbaz, when somebody first knows and then forgets. Right? I think that's a radical transformation, right? And it goes on into the next halacha as well in the Tosefta. Hashocheach et Torah. Somebody who forgot. He knew what was prohibited and he forgot the Torah. Va'avar averot harbe, and he transgressed many transgressions. Chayav al kol echad ve'echad. He's obligated for every one of them. Some of this gets into mechanisms for counting, right? But how many sins has one created? How do we separate, right? You've been eating forbidden food all your life. Is that one sin? Is it a sin every time you eat forbidden food? That's a whole different discussion. But at least you had to know. Ketzad, how so? Haya yodea sheyesh chelev. He knows that there's a prohibition of eating forbidden fat. Chelev is the type of fat you're not allowed to eat. V'amar ein ze chelev shechayavin alav. Right? This isn't the type of chelev that you're not allowed to eat. Haya yodea sheyesh dam. He knew that you're not allowed to eat blood. V'amar ein ze dam shechayavin alav. But he didn't know. He said, this isn't the type of blood that you're not strictly prohibited from. Right? There are different types of blood. Some are strictly prohibited. Some are less strictly prohibited. He's obligated for each one. But again, this is all munbaz, right? So I think there's just a radical, right, internalization of what does it mean to transgress, which is it's fundamental and it's very deep, right? The transgression isn't just the physical act, right? I'll give you another way to think about this. When we think about sins bein adam lechavero, between one person and another, right? Obviously, it's worse when you intend to, but if you injure another person, right? If I cut somebody's hand, their hand is going to hurt the same way whether I did it intentionally or unintentionally, right? I have physically wounded another person. It doesn't really matter, right? Everybody has, remember, their kids, right? Kids, I don't know, running in the house and they break something, okay? And the first thing they say, what's the first thing they say? Either they say, I don't know what you said, David, either like, I didn't do it, right? But more likely, if you know they did it, they said, it wasn't on purpose.
I didn't mean to.
I didn't mean to. It wasn't on purpose, right? To which I always say to them, fine, I'm not mad at you, but you got to clean it up, right? You got to and if it was careless, maybe, and they're old enough and they have a little bit of money, I'm like, okay, you broke your bicycle by being careless. Now you have to pay for your bicycle, right? I'm not mad. It wasn't on purpose, but there are consequences. But here we're talking about eating forbidden foods is a sin between God, bein adam lemakom, between people and human beings, between people and God. And there's something fundamentally different, right? It is not just what Munbaz is saying. It is not just the physical act, right? It is the forgetting. Now he has to maintain a difference in intention and non-intention. Right? Munbaz can't say, because it would be against the Torah to say the only time that you are obligated for a sin offering is if you do something intentionally. I've had this discussion with many students, right? A sin offering is not a punishment, right? A punishment, right? If you do something intentionally, you get punished. Sin offering is not a punishment. It's a little bit more like, well, you spilled the milk or you broke the bowl, clean it up. I'm not mad at you. You didn't do it on purpose, but clean up after yourself. Right? A chatat is, in a sense, a way of us cleaning up after ourselves, but there needs to be something tangible, and that tangibility is that the person forgot. The person knew and forgot, right? That's a mental error for which a person has to clean up the mess that he or she made. Whereas if you never knew that blood was prohibited and you eat blood, you're not liable. You don't bring a sin offering. Right? You should learn, right? Someone should tell you, and maybe the next time, but there's no sin offering for something that's completely without any level of awareness. Okay? So I think that is, even though that's not exactly what our parak, our chapter is going to talk about, I think it underlies a lot of the way the rabbis interpret the chapters that we're going to talk about. All right. That's part one. I think that's, if anyone remembers one thing, I think that's really, right? It's something fundamental to think about in the Judaism that we observe how important our own mental processes are, right? And how they interact with the real world, right? It's not just what we do, it's also what we know and what we think in terms of our responsibilities as human beings, but only, or at least particularly between God and people, right? Between people and people, consequences are probably more important. Okay, we are going to look at, there are two passages that are largely say the same thing in the Torah that are the focus of Masechet Horayot. The first one is Vayikra Dalet, and the second one is Bamidbar, it's at Tedvav. So we're not going to read the entire chapter. The chapter is long. The chapter in Vayikra is longer, and it largely goes through what sacrifices are brought for different entities that accidentally sin. Okay, so we'll just start a little bit. I highlighted some of the important words here. It begins with nefesh ki techata bishkaga. When a person sins unwittingly, mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo ta'asena, right? These are all not acts of omission, but commission. That's important, right? Not like there's the this is not just I didn't blow the shofar, but this is I ate forbidden foods. I had relations with a person who I'm not allowed to have relations with, or something like that. Okay, it's a committed act, an act that transgresses the Torah, and not an omission. All right, and then the Torah basically goes through different variations of who sins. Everybody gets their own particular sacrifice. Okay? The first case is HaKohen HaMashiach, which is another synonymous with the Kohen HaGadol. And right, obviously, this is the religious leader of the people. The second category, notice here I skipped 10 verses. The second category, which we're going to spend a lot of time on, is all of Israel. In Kol Adat Yisrael Yishgu. V'ne'alam davar meinei hakal. People didn't know that they had sinned. Right? And then they're going to eventually find out. Vashemu, later on in the verse. Okay, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how does it happen that everybody makes one error, right? That's a puzzle, right? How do you have the entire community? That's largely, this verse is largely what the whole Masechet is about. That one verse. So I also brought the sacrifice is v'hikrivu hakahal, ben bakar lechata, a male cattle, right? Large animal. Bakar is a large animal, a cow. Okay, a large, I think we don't call them a cow, an ox, a large ox. Okay, that's the sacrifice for the whole people. Then you skip down, we get another variation. Asher nasi yechatan, verse 22. If the nasi, we have them listed throughout the Torah. They seem to be the chieftains, right? The nasi, every tribe has its own chief. Largely speaking, a political leader, and they get a slightly different sacrifice from an individual. And then verse 27 is just an ordinary Israelite. Ve'im nefesh achat techata bishkaga. Me'am ha'aretz. Me'am ha'aretz, the people of the land. Am ha'aretz doesn't mean in the Torah what it means to the rabbis. It doesn't mean an ignoramus. It just means an ordinary individual, right? There are basically four categories. You've got the Kohen HaMashiach, the Kohen HaGadol. You've got the political leader, the Nasi. And then you have two variations of Israel. Everybody collectively sins, and an individual. And the individual brings, this is going to be important because we're going to talk about the individual, brings a Seirat Izim Tmima Nekeva, right? This line over here brings a female goat. Okay? What sacrifice everybody brings is always obviously very important, right? The Torah, certainly Vayikra, right? You got to bring the right sacrifice for the right sin, right? That's important to the rabbis. That's important for the Torah, and those things make a difference. So a lot of the Masechet is also going to be distinguishing between the situation in verse 13 and the situation in verse 28. Situation in verse 13 requires a bull to be brought, and that's when everybody sins. And then individuals would bring a female goat offering, right, how do you distinguish between, I don't know, 100 individuals, 1,000 individuals, 10,000 individuals, and all of the community, right? That's let's say an interpretive puzzle that the Masechet deals extensively with. Okay. Bamidbar Tetvav is largely the same thing. It doesn't have all of the details that Vayikra has. It doesn't have the Nasi. It doesn't have the Mashiach, the Kohen. And there are two major differences. Right? Verses 24 is the equivalent to the entire community. V'haya imeinei haida nasta lishkaga v'asu Kol Haida Par Ben Bakar, a large animal, a male large animal. That's the same as Vayikra. The problem is Usi'ir Za'echad Lechatat, and a goat, a male goat. Okay? That's a difference, right? Bamidbar and Vayikra differ, right? If the entire community, according to Vayikra, brings, entire community sins, they bring a male bull. And according to Bamidbar, they bring a male bull and a male goat. Right? That, for the rabbis, is the type of distinction that requires an answer. Rabbis are not going to leave that without an answer, right? Biblical scholars are going to give a different answer. Rabbis are obviously going to have to say that those refer to two different situations, right? There's got to be an explanation for that. It's a glaring distinction between Bamidbar and Vayikra. And the other distinction is also in the individual. It's a little bit more slight. If an individual, nefesh echat techata bishkaga, v'hikriva eiz bat shnata lechatat, a female goat, whereas in Vayikra, it's a male goat. A female goat. And what did I skip a pasuk over here? I might have skipped kafchet. Okay. All right, we'll come back to that. Right, the sacrifices for individuals are different. I think I should have added in kafchet. I think if I remember correctly, and we'll see it later on the source sheet, but Midbar has both female or male. Okay, again, differences, slight differences, clearly referring to the same kind of situation in the pshat, but the rabbis have to explain them. So here I listed it better, right? The difference in Vayikra and Bamidbar are that the sacrifices are different. Here you can see the communal sacrifice in Vayikra is a bull, and the communal sacrifice in Bamidbar is either a bull or a goat. And for the individual, I missed a verse over here. In Vayikra, it's either a female or a female goat or a male sheep. In verse Lamed Bet, somehow that skipped off the a female sheep, right? A female goat or a female sheep. And in Bamidbar, it's just a goat. And Rashi clearly points that, right? Rashi in Bamidbar says, Eiz bat shnata. Shar Averot, we'll come back to that. Other transgressions, Yachid Mavi Kisva Osira. An individual brings either a sheep or a goat. Ubazo Kavala Sira. In this case, he only brings a goat. Okay, small differences, but rabbis are going to have to solve that. And the way to solve that is that they say that Bamidbar refers to Avodah Zarah, the sin of idolatry, and Vayikra refers to all other sins, right? If you want, this is like just a classic, one of the easier examples that I can remember, right? There are many, many cases throughout the Torah where there are slight differences between, let's say, Shmot and Devarim, or Shmot and Bamidbar, or Vayikra and Devarim. There are many, many laws that appear in all four books, or in at least two, right? Breshit, excluding Breshit, at least appear in a couple of the books. And the rabbis are always going to harmonize those. Right? And this is just a very simple example. I'm not going to read it all, but it's a great example, I think, also because it shows both interpretive technique and value. Right? The interpretive technique is I have two partials that contradict each other. I have to resolve that. But the value is, well, if one of them has an extra has a different sacrifice, right? It must be that that one sin is worse than all the others. What's the worst avera that a person can do in the rabbinic imagination? It is avodah zarah. Okay, and you can see here, v'chitish guvelo tasu. This is the Sifrei, the commentary on Bamidbar. Avodah zarah hayta bichlal kol hamitzvot. Avodah zarah was like part of all of the other mitzvot. Shatzibor mevi alehen par. That the community brings a bull. V'arei hakatuv motziah michalan lahachmir aleh v'lidun b'kavua. Right, the verse is more stringent about it. And it gives an extra sacrifice. The word kavua here is a little difficult. Sheyev tzibor mevi aleha par v'sa'ir. Right? For that sin, how do we know it's worse? Well, it's avodah zarah. And second, there's two sins. There's two korbanot. Right? I don't think we need to read the rest of the Mishnah. The Midrash does the same thing for the individual. Right? Says that Bamidbar refers to avodah zarah, and Vayik refers to all other sins, right? And they just end up with a value statement. V'chi tishgu v'lo tasu, right? And you did something you shouldn't have been done. Ba'u kol ha'mitzvot lelamed al mitzvah achat, right? All the other mitzvot teach about this mitzvah. Ma ha'over kol ha'mitzvot porek ol umefer brit umegale panim b'torah. Transgressions, right, is to throw off a yoke, right? The burden of all malchut shamayim, of observance of mitzvot, breaks the covenant and acts brazenly. Megale panim b'torah, acts brazenly. Af over al mitzvah chat, even one mitzvah, right? You do all the other mitzvot, you're porek ol mefer brit umegale panim b'torah, and that one mitzvah avodah zarah is equivalent, right? You can find many sugiot in the Gemara that will say the same thing. This is the origin of that idea. Okay, any questions so far? So far we've covered the radical transformation of the meaning of shogeg, which I think is a broad concept that comes up in other places throughout rabbinic literature. And then in particular, where our Masechet comes from in the Bible, in the Torah, from Vayikra Dalet and Bamidbar Tedvav. And along with that, the rabbinic difference between Bamidbar Tedvav referring to Avodah Zarah and Vayikra Dalet referring to any other mitzvot, any other mitzvah. In one of my favorite, I don't know, it's a very, I think, learned, critical commentary on the Mishnah that appears on Sefaria these days. It's all in Hebrew. It's a little wordy, a little technical. So I wanted to bring in some of the summaries. And I translated them into English, which is today much easier due to my friend ChatGPT that can translate everything instantly into English. So Safrai is a work between the son and the father. Shmuel was the father, and Zev Safrai, who is the son. Pointed out the major differences between the pshat of the Torah and the rabbinic teachings that we're going to see in our Masechet. The most important one is that the mistake of a community to the rabbis refers to an error made by the court. That's what Horayot is about, right? The Torah just says the community erred. It's a little nebulous. What does that mean? I tried to look up some critical mafarshim, and it's very hard to figure out. How is it that a large scale group of people sin? But to the rabbis, this is a mistaken ruling by the court, which allows the rabbis to talk about courts, which is a topic clearly the rabbis want to talk about. And it imposes on the Torah a legislative system that is a little bit harder to locate. The Torah does talk about a Beit Din, a court, and going to the Shoftim in Jerusalem, or it doesn't mention Jerusalem, but in the central place. It's a little hard to, a little bit looser. The rabbis have a much, let's say, more structured vision of how that works. Yeah, Debbie, you have a question?
So that explains, I'm sorry I joined you a few minutes late, but that
Okay.
explains the title of,
Exactly. Correct.
okay.
Oh, what happened? How did
All
I
right,
lose my?
I just turned off the sharing so that we could see Debbie when she asks questions. Sorry about that. It's
You can go
not
back to it.
working.
Yeah. That the name of the Masechet is Horayot rulings, right? And the Masechet explores when is somebody culpable as an individual and when is the court culpable, right? But that is not there in the Pshat of the Torah, right? Those verses in Vayikra and Bamidbar do not speak of a court. Right? The rabbis interpret how is it, right? I think the way I would envision it is that they interpret the court, right? Once a mistake is an internal mental process. You knew something and you forgot it. Now we have to figure out who's responsible for you forgetting it, right? What if I just was told the wrong thing? It's a fascinating, very important question, right? That is still relevant, right? I think very relevant to us today, right? When you're told to do something and it's wrong, are you culpable as an individual, or is the person who gave you the wrong instruction culpable? And so we're going to talk a lot about that throughout the Masechet, but it's not there in the Torah itself. The Torah doesn't explicitly mention that. That is the rabbinic interpretation of that. All right, I'm going to go back. I can put up the source sheet here. The rabbis completely demote the role of the Kohen. Okay, the Kohen HaMashiach, the Kohen HaGadol, right? This is something we see throughout rabbinic literature. The Kohen HaMashiach barely gets any attention in our Masechet. Right? He's mentioned there because he's in the Torah, right? And the rabbis are interpreting the Torah, but the rabbis don't picture him as representing the public. They would picture him as just an individual, an elevated individual, an honored individual, but his culpability is for himself alone, and not. They don't picture the Kohen as being the court, right? And that is a major tension between, let's say, earlier second to second temple period and the way the rabbis envision things running. Rabbinic literature clearly is a downplay of priestly authority and a transfer from that priestly authority to the authority of the rabbis and the sages. You can see that throughout rabbinic literature, something that will be talked about in an upcoming book I'm working, almost finished. Okay.
Would that also be a function of the time they lived in?
Definitely. There's no doubt that when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, right, the power source of the priest. I do think it exists before, right? It's important to remember a lot of the tensions that we see played out later, a lot of institutions that we see become prominent in rabbinic times existed in the Second Temple times. The synagogue, right? Synagogues existed in the Second Temple time. But without a Beit HaMikdash, the synagogue becomes much more important. Talmud Torah, Gimilut Chasadim, these are things that existed, right? Clearly existed for as long as we can record, but they don't need to be there instead of sacrifice, right? To the rabbis, Talmud Torah, Gimilut Chasadim, those are the kinds of things that replace sacrifice. When sacrifice is still possible, then there's nothing that replaces sacrifice. And that's the same thing with the priestly authority. The priest clearly, although, even to this day, there's still, and it took time. These processes take time, right? People don't change immediately, but clearly wisdom and in biblical interpretation and the kinds of things the rabbis do, and also non-genealogical, right? Priestly authority is transferred from father to son. Having your father a rabbi might be nice, might be an advantage, but you got to learn if you want to be knowledgeable. It's not going to come to you just because your dad was a rabbi or, Okay. The Nasi is barely referenced. There is a Nasi in the rabbinic period, but it's very different, and the rabbis barely pay any attention to him. And what they function on the most is the difference between the individual and the court, right? That's what the Masechet is largely about, right? The conflict between an individual who bears responsibility, between the individual and the court, and we're going to see that. We're going to see that in most of these mishnayot. Okay, let's learn. We've got about 20 minutes left. I want to learn a few of the first mishnayot. We'll see what we can get through in the first Masechet. Again, I don't know what people normally do in this format, I like to read some of the texts out loud. I think even if you've learned them alone on your own, it's good to refresh ourselves and to read them together and to see a little bit where they come from. On the left-hand side, you'll all have copies of this source. The left-hand side, I brought a lot of like the Midrashim. On the right-hand side, I always brought the Mishnah with some comments on the Mishnah, but it's not a translation, right? If I think that going forward, doing more teaching with Drisha, you want a translation, I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, but I will translate Be'al Peh as we read a little bit. Horu Beit Din la'avor al achat mikol mitzvot hamorot b'Torah. Right, the Beit Din said to go transgress. We're going to see what that means. This is just the opening salve. V'halach hayachid v'asa shogeg al pihen. And a person went and acted accidentally, meaning the person just didn't know that the court had issued a mistaken ruling. Bein sha'asu v'asa imahem, bein sha'asu v'asa acharehen, bein shelo asu v'asa. It doesn't matter whether the court, the plural verbs here, asu is the court and the asa is the individual. It doesn't matter whether the court did the act or didn't do the act, right? The court's act is not important. It's the court's ruling that's important. It's pator mipnei shetala bebeit din, right? He hung it on the Beit Din. And I think that is a very important verb there, the tala, that he hung it on the Beit Din. Right? I brought in two slightly different ways of understanding this. Clearly, one way is that this individual didn't know that it was wrong because the court told him, for instance, eat a certain substance or act a certain way on Shabbat, or you're allowed to have relations with a certain category of person, and the court was wrong. But the other thing I think to keep in mind here is that there is going to be a sacrifice here, right? Tala bebeit din, he kind of literally hung the transgression on the court. Right? The transgression is accredited to the court, and therefore the individual does not need to bring that sacrifice.
Couldn't Talad just mean depend? Like he depended on the Beit Din for his source of behavior?
Yeah, it can mean, right? But it's still, right, it's important to remember, I think we need to pay attention in the Masechet. Are there cases, and there may be, where no one brings a sacrifice, right? If there's been a sin done, according to let's say, the biblical mentality, something needs to cleanse for that sin. I want to pay attention if there's something that sort of falls between the cracks here, right? Where neither the individual nor the court needs to bring. And there are such cases over here. But yeah, you can translate it if you want. Tala bebeit din, he made his act dependent on the court. Okay, all right. That's like just the basic rule, right? There's a whole 400-page book on Masechet Horayot. I did not succeed in Hebrew in going through it all. It's a massive tome. But I think it's clear that the Mishnah begins with a basic rule, and now we're going to begin to talk about exceptions for them. And this one is a very interesting one. Horu Beit Din v'yada echad mehen shata'u. Right? The court made a rule, and one of the court knew that it was a mistake. Okay? Right? A Beit Din is going to be composed, right? The Mishnah doesn't get through exactly how many people are on this Beit Din, but let's imagine it's the Beit Din HaGadol with 71 people on it, according to Sanhedrin, right? Chances are somebody might know that there's something wrong there, right? So one of them knew that there was a mistake. O Talmid v'hu ra'uin lahora'ah, right? Or maybe one of the students, like a stage. Do you say it in English? In Israel, we have a stage, right? Everyone knows what a stage is, right? Apprentice, if you will. A student sitting there.
An intern.
An intern, right? In Israel, we call it a stage. I guess that's based on the Brits. So he was a student, and he had gotten to the level where he's ra'ui lahoraya, right? He's fit, right? To become to issue halachic rulings. V'halacha v'asa al pihen. Okay, so I want to figure out who did. We're going to come back to who is the person who transgressed. Bein sha'asu v'asa imahem, bein sha'asu v'asa acharehen, bein shelo asu v'asa, harei ze chayav. All the same versions before. He's liable mipnei shelo tara b'beitin, because he did not make it dependent on the court. Okay, we're going to come back to a puzzle over here. Who is the person who transgressed? Okay. Zehaklal, right? This is the general rule. Hatoreh be'atzmo chayav, v'hatoreh bebeitin patur. Somebody who relies on his own, whether we use your translation, or hangs the sin on himself, he's liable as an individual. And if he's reliant on the court, then he as an individual is exempt. So the question over here really is, and there's going to see a nice little sugya between the dispute between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, between who is the one who went and acted. Is it a member of the court who acted that way, or the student, or is it just a regular individual? Okay, so let's read the Bavli over here. I brought a couple sugyot just to help us flesh some of these things out. Ra'ui lahoreah, right? He is fit to teach. Right? Quote of the Mishnah. Kagon man, like who? Amar Rava Kagon Shimon ben Azai v'Shimon ben Zoma. Two colleagues, right? You're familiar with the names from the Seder. Two colleagues, friends of Rabbi Akiva. Shimon ben Azai is mentioned in the version of the Mishnah found in the Sifra, the Midrash on Vayikra. He's also, I believe, found in the Tosefta. Great, needless to say, great Talmidei Chachamim, right? As high as they go, right? Amar le Abai v'chi hai gavna mezidhu. Someone like that, that's intentional sin, right? He knows, right? Shimon ben Azai and Shimon ben Zoma are great Talmidei Chachamim, right? Abai seems to be reading v'halach v'asa al pihen, that they went and did it as one of the members of the court, right? One of the members of the court went and acted that way. But Abai says that can't be. It can't be Shimon ben Azai, Shimon ben Zoma. So, because Shimon ben Azai and Shimon ben Zoma know the Torah very well. So if they go and they know that the court erred, then how can they bring an accidental sacrifice? That's intentional sin. What is the case where somebody went and brings an accidental sin on his own, a sin offering on his own? Kagon de yadada asur, he knows that it's prohibited. His mistake was he thought that there's a mitzvah to listen to the sages, to listen to the rabbis, right? Which is a very interesting statement, by the way, right? I think I would read this in a larger sense as saying, look, there's not a mitzvah to lishmoa b'divrei chachamim when they tell you the wrong thing to do, right? If you know that somebody is telling you something wrong, then don't do it, right? But he at least is considered shogeg, right, accidental, because he thinks that he's obligated to observe whatever the sages do. And that might be true even for great sages. Okay? So the person who's done it, right, it makes some sense out of the Mishnah, right, is accidental, but he's one of the court. And since he is culpable for an accidental offering, because he made a mistake and did a prohibited act, but he's not considered mazid, intentional, because he thought that even though the act was wrong, he has to listen to the court. Now, the Yerushalmi has a different version of this. It starts out the same. I brought in the Bartanura, but basically he's just commenting on the Bavli. The Yerushalmi is a lot harder, right, as it usually is. Ela ki anan kayamin, Beyodea kol haTorah ubeyodea oto davar, right? What are we dealing with? Somebody who knows the whole Torah, and he knows that matter, meaning he's a good Talmid Chacham, he knows what's Aser and what's not Aser. Elashu kotoel lomar Torah amra achreihem achreihem. He makes a mistake thinking that the Torah says follow the sages. Achrei rabim lahatot, right? A reference to that verse. That's the same as the Bavli, right? But then the Yerushalmi rejects that. V'im b'toel lomar haTorah amra achreihem achreihen. Ein ze Shimon ben Azai. Right? Shimon ben Azai wouldn't make that mistake. Shimon ben Azai knows that the Torah doesn't say blindly follow the sages. Rather, kehada detane yachol im yomru lecha al yamin shehi small, v'al small shehi yamin. If the court tells you that right is left and left is right, tishma lehem, you should listen to them. Talmud Lomar, the Torah says, lalechet yaminu small. Sheyomru al yamin shehu yamin v'al small shehi small. That you should listen to the court when they tell you what's right is right and what's left is left. Right? There is a fundamental. You may be familiar with the exact opposite. Right? That there's a mitzvah to listen to the Chachamim. Afilu sheyomru lecha yamin hu small v'small hu yamin. Right? It's quoted a lot by rabbis. Right? It's against the Yerushalmi. Right? It's a machloket between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says no, right? The individual here, right? A person who listens blindly to the court, right, is not like Shimon ben Azai, right? The rabbis don't want you blindly following them. And then you have to get what's the interpretation of the Mishnah? I'll just read you a summary I wrote from this guy's name is, I'm forgetting it. First name is blanking me. Tzvi Steinfeld was a professor at Bar Ilan University, where I did my PhD. I think he's deceased. Is the one who wrote the book. It's an excellent book. It's very long. That the more original interpretation was that a regular individual acted this way. And there's a special ruling with regard to the court. For the court to be liable, the entire court must issue the ruling. You're not somebody being tola bebeit din, dependent on the court or hanging his sin on the court. There is no court unless, at least in this matter, unless there's unanimity. The second that there is a discrepancy among any members of the court, it breaks the existence of a court. Right? And therefore, the individual is liable as an individual, and the court is no longer liable. Okay, I want to read one more. I'm going to run a little bit out of time. I want to read one more very important Mishnah that I want to make sure that we get to today, which I think is also fundamental. That's Mishnah Gimel. We're going to skip Mishnah Bet, although it's very interesting. Horu beit din la'akor et kol haguf. Amru, ein nida b'Torah, ein Shabbat b'Torah, ein avodah zarah b'Torah, harei elu p'turim. Okay, the court, if the court rules in a blatant, obviously way against something that is explicit in the Torah, the prohibition of the nida, the prohibition of malacha on Shabbat, and the prohibition of avodah zarah, three cardinal sins, if you will. I think probably nida here is a stand-in for sexual prohibitions, right? You've got here like a different cardinal three, not exactly murder, but they're all because we need things to be between a person and heaven, not between people. But we have a different, let's say, a cardinal sins between God and human beings, sexual sins, Shabbat, and avodah zarah and idol worship, right? That they're exempt, right? The individual would be liable in this case, and the court would be exempt, right? I think another way of saying it, like, there's no such thing as a court that doesn't know about Shabbat. There's no such thing as a court that says it's so blatantly against the Torah that that's not really a court anymore. What it is, it's not enough to make them make your korban dependent upon them. However, horu levatel miktzat ulekayem miktzat, if the court ruled to annul some of the mitzvah and fulfill some of it, harei elu chayavim, then the court is liable. Right? They get the details wrong. And now we get some quintessential rabbinic interpretations that are not explicit in the Torah, which I think is interesting, right? The rabbis seem to be aware of the, let's say, call it the Rashi Prakim, which is what I call it here, the chapter heads that are in the Torah, and then the details that are involved in rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. For instance, some of these, I don't know if everyone's familiar with, Ketzad Amru, Yesh Nida b'Torah. They said, okay, there are, let's say, prohibitions of menstruation in the Torah, Aval Haba al Shomer Yom Keneged Yom Patur. But one who has relations with a woman, this is a woman who experienced bleeding not during her menstrual cycle. She's what's called a Shomer Yom Keneged Yom. She sits 1 day for every 1 day of bleeding, unless she has 3 days of bleeding, in which she becomes a Zava Gedola, which, you know, if you have learned Nida yet, it's a major topic in Nida. It's not there in the Torah. There's no such thing as that in the Torah. The Torah distinguishes between a menstrual bleeding and non-menstrual bleeding, but the Torah doesn't really talk about how, right? Besides the fact that it happens in a different day. The rabbis have a system of major Zava and minor Zava. Don't want to get all into that right now. It's not there in the Torah, and therefore, if the court makes that error, then the court is culpable. I think what they're kind of saying is like the details, we can understand a court not following the details. The chapter heads, it makes no sense. It really doesn't make any sense to say someone reads the Torah doesn't know Nida Asura b'Torah, Malacha, right? Kol Oseh Malacha Yomot Yumat, right? You can't read the Torah and not understand that you can't do labor on Shabbat. Which labors? We'll see. Yesh Shabbat b'Torah, aval hamotzi mi reshut yachid u'reshut rabim patur. They know that Shabbat is prohibited, but taking from one domain to another is exempt, right? That's not there explicitly in the Torah either, right? Remember, Chagiga says Shabbat is like mountains of halacha hanging by a thread, right? There's not a lot of verses. It keeps saying, don't do malacha, don't do malacha. But as far as explicating what's malacha, there's really not a lot in the Torah about that. The rabbis are aware of that. And taking from one domain to another it's like almost there in the Torah. I'd say it's more there than like a lot of other malachot, but it's not quite there yet. Yesh avodah zarah b'Torah, aval mishtachave patur, harei chayavin, right? Patur. Right? In that case, right, if somebody who says bowing down to an idol is permitted, right, because that's not how we worship, maybe we worship by a sacrifice, the court is liable, right? That is an understandable mistake for the court to make, right? And therefore the court is liable and not the individuals. Now, just the last thing I want to do before I just close it up today, there's an interesting transformation by the time you get to the later Amoraic period, right? The further you get, the more that like things that we think of like today, anybody who keeps Shabbat, and I'm talking about somebody who really keeps Shabbat, knows you can't carry on Shabbat. That is a basic rule of Shabbat, right? It is not something that I can imagine a court of learned individuals forgetting, right? In the Tannaitic period, they imagine that, right? By the time you go further and further, I didn't bring in the whole Bavli on this, but the further you get in the development of the entrenchment, if you will, of rabbinic law, the less people, the more that the details become chapter heads, right? There are certain things like today I could imagine, for instance, we're not going to even read that. Everybody knows that like, there's certain, like, anybody who keeps Shabbat knows there's certain things that you don't do. The finer details of, take a malacha like borer, right? Separating things on your plate, right? Are much more obscure. People aren't going to know those things. Shmuel identifies it over here with ein beitin chayavin ad sheyoru b'davar she'ein hatzdukim modim bo, right? A court isn't liable until they teach something that the heretics, right? The heretics don't agree with. Tzedukim here is a stand-in for heretics. If even the heretics keep this halacha, right? Then the court is patur, right? They're exempt, because how can I even imagine that the court wouldn't know something that even heretical Sadducees keep. Right? If the court makes that ruling, everybody should know that it's a bad ruling, right? And therefore the court is exempt and the individuals, right? There's a certain amount of carving out of room for individual responsibility, but I think that's going to change, and I think it would change from time to time, right? Today, what we expect people to know is very different from what we would expect people to know in different times and different periods. All right. That's, I think, about as far as we're going to get. We will continue with the source sheet next time. There is, I would encourage you to look through it. There's a lot of information, parallels on the left-hand column, little tidbits. I think it's an interesting Masechet. I think it's a fascinating Masechet.
Thank you everyone for coming back. It's great to be learning Mishnah live together, and look forward to learning more with you about Horayot next week. Now, Horayot is a short Masechet. With this second week is the last class on this particular chapter, but fear not. Following next week may be the 13th, but starting on July 20th, we will continue with Zvachim with Dr. Avi Wallfish. You can sign up for this at drisha.org/classes. Thank you, everyone, and take care.